Hi, welcome to part one of the Three Brass Pennies. This story is in lesson 1.03, and since it's part one, that means you have another part to watch. There's two parts to this story, mainly because we couldn't make the video long enough to cover the entire story. So, when you're done with part one, make sure you move on to part two so that you get the entire story through the videos. Let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to jump right in. Again, this story is called The Three Brass Pennies. It is a Chinese legend retold by Augusta Huell Seaman. All right, here we go. It is in the good old-fashioned way that this fairy story begins, as all such stories should. Once upon a time. And a very long time ago it was, in the faraway city of Wangpo, in that faraway country, China. Within this city lived a young man, Ah Fo by name, who was poor in worldly goods, but of a rarely studious and thoughtful turn of mind. One fine day it chanced that he was walking through the forest outside the city, thinking deeply on existence and the universe in general, when he came suddenly face to face with a huge spider web stretched across the path, in whose silky meshes a bee was wound and struggling vainly to be free, while an ugly spider sat in the center and watched its fruitless or useless efforts. Many might have dodged the web and sauntered on, or strolled on, leaving the hapless bee, the unlucky bee, to its fate. But Ah Fo was not of this nature. He could not pass a helpless creature in trouble if it was in his power to assist. Gingerly, very carefully, therefore, he took an end of his cotton robe, extracted the bee from the web, and then, not daring to leave it near its enemy, so exhausted was it, he carried it to his home in the city. There, he placed it on his writing table to recover, while he himself sat down to resume his interrupted thoughts on philosophy. While he was so occupied, the bee slowly regained its strength, crawled to a cake of wet India ink, which the Chinese use for their writing instead of our liquid variety. There it remained standing for a moment, perfectly still. Then it lit on a sheet of blank paper. So it landed gently on a sheet of blank paper. After that, it spread its wings and flew out of the window, quite unperceived by the dreaming Ah Fo, so quite unnoticed by the dreaming Ah Fo. It was when that young student awoke from his revive, a daydream, however, that a surprise awaited him. Looking about for that lately rescued bee, he could perceive no sign of him. But there, before him, on a sheet of white paper, directly in the center, where the bee had stood, was printed in fresh ink the Chinese character representing the word gratitude. It was an astonishing moment for Ah Fo. How the symbol had come there, he could not imagine, yet he could not but attribute it in some manner to the lately rescued insect. He spent the remainder of the day cogitating upon the question, or thinking intensely upon the question, and lay awake half the night bewildered by the mystery, completely confused. Early next morning, however, a solution arrived before a note was sent to him, which read, "There is a reward awaiting you, Ah Fo, for mercy to a tiny creature in desperate flight, if you will call today at the fourth house on the street of the Purple Lantern." Naturally, Ah Fo let no grass grow under his heels in seeking out the street and house designated. Here he found an old man living in the utmost simplicity, who shook hands with himself within his voluminous sleeves, full and billowing sleeves, as this is the Chinese custom of greeting, and bade Ah Fo to enter and be seated. When the young student had done so, the old man seated himself opposite and began. I know that you are bewildered by the affair which happened yesterday, but I will at once dispel the mystery. I am a magician. Through all these many years, I have devoted my power to the relief of suffering and the betterment of humanity. Long have I been pursued, however, by a fellow magician more subtle than I, so more crafty than I, and entirely unscrupulous, lacking morals, who would rid the city of me because I have been accustomed to undo much of his evil by my merciful arts. It has been well understood that should he ever lure me into his clutches, my life would be forfeit, lost, unless some kindly soul would rescue me. In that case, his power over me would vanish forever. Yesterday, I changed myself in a bee in order to fly quickly to some distant city where I was needed. He must have been spying upon me, for he changed himself into a huge spider, and in the forest where I settled to rest a while, he caught me in his wicked web. It was the first and only time this had ever happened, and I gave myself up for lost, when you appeared, and broke his spell over me forever. Now, I have little in worldly goods with which to reward you, but I have the power to make you rich and successful, provided you use my gift properly and with discretion, which means care and judgment in decision-making. Here are 3 brass pennies. They do not look any different from our ordinary money, and indeed they do not, being simply the brass Chinese cash with a square hole in the middle of each. But they are magic pennies, and he who possesses them may have a wish for each. This wish he may enjoy just as long as he keeps the penny in his possession, but he loses it should he part with the coin. Only by mentioning these wishes to me, however, may they be attained. Then the magician spread out the 3 pennies before him on the table and stared thoughtfully at Ah Fo through his great, square, horn-rimmed spectacles. "Let us now see," he began. "You will desire, no doubt, an unlimited supply of gold and jewels, a huge castle in the best part of the town, and the beautiful daughter of the emperor for your wife?" He was about to touch the first penny with his forefinger when Ah Fo raised his hand. "A moment, I pray you," began the student. "This is too serious a matter to be decided so speedily. I feel that the possessions you suggest might not be pure joy. Allow me, if you will, to go home and think about this matter over. Tomorrow, after due consideration, I may be better able to come to a decision." The magician smiled, such a benevolent or kind-hearted and delighted smile. "I have not seen so much discretion and forethought or thinking ahead in many a long day," he exclaimed. "Go and consider the matters by all means, and may Confucius, who is an ancient Chinese philosopher known for his wisdom, guide your meditations." And Ah Fo took his departure. The next morning he was early at the magician's house. "I have carefully considered the matter, O wise and generous one," he announced. "And what might your decision be?" asked the magician as he spread out the 3 brass pennies before him. "I would ask first," went on Ah Fo, "for the power to read accurately the thoughts of others. Secondly, for the power to foretell my own future at least a month in advance of any given moment. Third, for the power to acquire all learning without any effort." When he had finished, the magician sat back with a gasp, took off his spectacles and wiped them, put on once more, and stared at Ah Fo in astonishment and not a little dismay. "This is most unusual," he stammered, "not to say somewhat dangerous. Have you dully considered, my son, the extent of all you ask?" "I've duly considered," replied Otho, "and I feel that nothing but these demands can satisfy me. If you intend to be so good as to grant any wishes, I have no others." "Very well, then," agreed the magician, reluctantly, and he touched each penny before him, murmuring something in a language unknown to Ah Fo. Then he handed them to the young man, bidding him fasten each securely about his neck and touch the proper one of them when he made any of the three wishes. And he carefully indicated the wish represented by each penny, for they all bore slightly different markings. "And now, may I inquire what you intend to do?" asked the old man curiously. "I intend to go out and see all the world, acquire all wisdom, and possibly, at the end, overthrow this dynasty and become ruler of the celestial kingdom myself." A dynasty is a line of rulers of the same family. "You are perfectly equipped to do so. I wish you all success," smiled the magician. But he gazed after the young man somewhat sadly as Ah Fo walked away. "Come back and see me, I beg, when you have attained your purpose," he called after him. When Ah Fo reached his home, elated or overjoyed by his rare fortune, he packed up his small belongings in preparation for starting out on his tour of the world. He had decided that he would see his own country before going on to others. So he planned to cross the great river below the city and travel into the southern part of China. But first, in order to test the power of his pennies, he touched the one enabling him to see into the future, in order that he might ascertain the wisdom of this plan, or determine the wisdom of his plan. To his horror, he saw himself in a small boat or sampan on the river in the midst of a violent storm. The sampan was suddenly upset. He saw himself struggling in the waves and finally disappearing beneath the black water. "This will never, never do," he cried, trembling at a fate so terrible. "I was fortunate to have thought of looking the matter up before I started. Evidently, the southern route is not safe. I will investigate the northern one, though I would have preferred the other." He consulted his penny, but only to behold himself traveling through the mountains beset by bandits and left dying by the roadside. Hurriedly he changed his plans again, with the thought of a western route across the country, this time to discover himself lost in a burning desert, parched with thirst, stricken, or suddenly overwhelmed with a fever, and perishing alone under the pitiless sun. In a frenzy, he turned to the last resort, crying, "I will cross the seas out of this wretched country and see the rest of the world first." But again his prophetic, or predicting the future penny, revealed to him a vision of himself captured by pirates and set to work at the galleys, which are ships moved mostly by slaves at the oars. Pale with fright at the dangers he had so narrowly escaped, Ah Fo sat down to consider the matter. This is the end of part 1. Be sure to check out part 2 so that you can listen to the rest of the story, The Three Brass Pennies.